Cop punches old black man, finds out he's FBI. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. Eric Matthews' patrol car cruised down the dimly lit streets of West End, a neighborhood that seemed to have given up on itself. As he drove, his eyes scanned the familiar streets, searching for anything that might break the monotony of the night. It was always the same. Empty storefronts, run-down houses, and the occasional flicker of movement in the shadows. West End was a place where dreams went to die. Or at least, that's how Eric saw it. Eric wasn't supposed to be here. At least not in his mind. He had joined the police force with big dreams, imagining himself working in the suburbs or downtown, places where he could make a real difference. Instead, he was stuck on the night shift, patrolling what felt like a forgotten part of the city, a place that most of the world turned a blind eye to. The streets of West End were quiet tonight, but Eric knew that could change in an instant. His eyes darted back and forth, watching for anything that seemed out of place. A stray cat darted across the street, disappearing into an alleyway. A trash bag rustled in the wind, its contents spilling out onto the sidewalk. Eric's hands tightened around the steering wheel. He had learned long ago that in West End, you couldn't let your guard down. He checked the clock on his dashboard, just past 11 p.m. Another hour to go, he thought. Another hour before he could clock out and leave this place behind, at least for a few hours. He had learned to compartmentalize his life, keeping his work and home separate. But lately, the lines between the two had started to blur. He had been more irritable lately, more distant. His wife Marie had noticed it too. She had tried to talk to him about it, but Eric wasn't ready to have that conversation. Not yet. As he drove, Eric's mind wandered back to the argument he had had with Marie earlier that day. She had been upset that he missed another one of their son's soccer games, and Eric knew she was right. He had been missing a lot lately. Soccer games, school plays, family dinners. But in his mind, he had justified it. Someone had to pay the bills after all. Someone had to keep the family afloat. Marie didn't understand, though. She didn't see the things Eric saw on a daily basis. The drugs, the violence, the hopelessness. She didn't see how this place was slowly chipping away at him, turning him into someone he didn't recognize. But how could he explain that to her? How could he make her understand when he barely understood it himself? Eric's radio crackled to life, pulling him out of his thoughts. Unit 42, do you copy? The voice on the other end was familiar, but Eric didn't recognize it right away. It took him a second to remember it was Officer Lewis, one of the rookies who had joined the force a few months ago. Eric reached for the radio, pressing the button to respond. This is Unit 42, I copy. There's been a report of suspicious activity near Maple and 3rd. Can you check it out? Eric sighed. Maple and 3rd was a few blocks away, near the edge of West End. It wasn't the worst part of town, but it wasn't exactly the best either. He could already picture it. A group of kids loitering on the corner, up to no good. Or maybe it was just someone passing through, minding their own business. Either way, it was his job to check it out. I'm on my way, Eric responded, shifting the car into gear and making his way toward Maple and 3rd. The streets were still quiet as he drove, the only sounds coming from the hum of his engine and the occasional crackle of his radio. As he approached the intersection, Eric slowed the car, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of activity. At first, everything seemed normal. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. A few cars were parked along the curb, their windows fogged up from the cold. But then out of the corner of his eye, Eric saw something, or rather someone. A man hunched over and moving slowly was walking down the sidewalk. He was an older black man, dressed in a worn-out coat and carrying a small plastic grocery bag in one hand. His other hand gripped a cane, which he used to steady himself as he walked. His hat was pulled low over his brow, obscuring his face. Eric's eyes narrowed as he watched the man. It was almost midnight, and this guy seemed out of place. Most people in West End didn't walk around at this hour, especially not alone. It wasn't safe. But this man didn't seem concerned about his surroundings. He walked at a deliberate pace as if he knew exactly where he was going. Eric's instincts, or more accurately, his biases, kicked in. Something about the man didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way he was moving, or maybe it was just the fact that he was out so late. Either way, Eric felt a familiar surge of suspicion. He pulled the patrol car to the curb, his eyes never leaving the man as he switched on his lights. The blue and red glow illuminated the empty street, casting an eerie light over the scene. Eric watched as the man stopped walking, but he didn't look up. He didn't even acknowledge the flashing lights. Eric felt a spark of irritation. Most people in this neighborhood would at least glance in the direction of a police car, but this man seemed completely unfazed. It was almost as if he didn't care, as if he had nothing to fear. Eric opened the door and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the cracked pavement. "Hey!" he called out, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night. The man stopped walking, but didn't turn around. For a moment, Eric thought he hadn't heard him, but then the man slowly turned his head to look at the officer. His face was worn and wrinkled with age, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Eric demanded, walking closer. His tone was sharp, laced with suspicion. The man adjusted his grip on the cane, but he didn't seem rattled. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. "Just heading home, officer," the man replied in a soft, even voice. There was no tremor of fear in his voice, no nervous glances, just a steady, simple reply. Eric's eyes narrowed further. This old man should be nervous. He should be fidgeting under the weight of Eric's presence. That's how it usually went, especially in this neighborhood. But this man seemed indifferent, too indifferent. "At this time of night," Eric pressed, taking another step closer. "Where's home?" "Just a few blocks away," the man answered, his voice calm and measured. "Needed to pick up a few things from the store before heading back." Eric glanced at the bag in the man's hand. It seemed light, barely anything in it. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his suspicion deepening. "Groceries," the man replied, lifting the bag slightly to reveal its contents. "A loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a couple of canned goods. Nothing out of the ordinary." But Eric wasn't satisfied. His gut told him there had to be more to this man's story. "Got any ID?" he asked, his voice hardening. The man nodded slowly, reaching into his coat pocket with deliberate care. He pulled out a worn wallet and handed it over without a word. Eric snatched it from his hand, scanning the name. William Johnson. The address was local, just a few streets over. Everything seemed to be checked out, but still, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the man's story that bothered him. It was the fact that he wasn't afraid. There was no hesitation in his movements, no anxiety in his voice. It was as if he didn't care that he was being questioned by a police officer. Eric handed the ID back with a flick of his wrist. "What are you really doing out here?" he asked, leaning closer. His voice dropped to a low growl, laced with suspicion. "I already told you, officer," William said, his voice still calm. "I'm just heading home." William's calmness was unnerving. Eric's jaw tightened as he took a step back, glancing over at the patrol car. The neighborhood was dead quiet, no one around to witness the exchange. Eric liked it that way. He didn't want an audience. It was bad enough that this man wasn't reacting the way people usually did when confronted by the police. In his years as an officer, Eric had developed a sort of sixth sense, one that told him when people were hiding something. It wasn't always about what they said, it was about how they said it. The nervous shift in their voice, the subtle way their hands trembled when they reached for their ID, the glances they stole when they thought he wasn't looking. Most people, guilty or not, got jittery when dealing with the police. But not this guy. Eric stared at William, feeling the irritation bubble beneath his skin. Who did this man think he was? Walking around this late without a care in the world? Didn't he understand how dangerous this neighborhood was? Didn't he realize that being out at this time of night made him a suspect by default? "Heading home," Eric repeated, more to himself than to William. His eyes flicked over the old man's frail frame. The coat he wore was old and worn, its edges frayed. The plastic bag he carried looked almost weightless in his hand. This didn't look like a man who was causing trouble. But it wasn't just about appearances, was it? He had seen too much in West End to trust his first instincts. Drugs, violence, desperation, they were all too common here. People didn't always look like criminals. Sometimes they were just tired men with grocery bags and canes, and sometimes they were something else entirely. Eric's mind raced. He didn't have any real reason to hold the man here, but something kept him from letting it go. Maybe it was the late hour, Or maybe it was the unspoken tension in the air between them, like an invisible rope stretched too tight, waiting to snap. "I've been on this beat long enough to know when someone's hiding something," Eric said, his voice a little softer but no less sharp. "You're out here alone, after midnight in a neighborhood like this, and you expect me to believe you're just out for a stroll?" William met Eric's gaze, his face calm but his eyes suddenly sharper, as if he were sizing Eric up in a way the officer hadn't expected. It was unsettling the way this old man seemed to be reading him. "I told you the truth, officer," William said. "I'm just heading home." Eric hated how steady the man's voice was. There wasn't a flicker of doubt, not even a hint of fear. It reminded him of the rookies who came in all eager, acting like they had the world figured out, like they could handle anything. But this wasn't some rookie. This was an old man, a civilian, and he wasn't giving Eric an inch. There was a time when Eric thought he understood people like William. When he first joined the force, he had believed in the idea of justice, of keeping people safe, of rooting out the bad seeds to protect the good. But over the years, those lines had blurred. The more he saw of the world, the less he trusted anyone in it. People lied, people schemed, and more often than not, people disappointed him. Eric took another step closer, his voice hardening. "You need to understand something. Walking around at this hour, especially in this neighborhood, puts you under suspicion. So why don't you drop the act and tell me what you're really doing out here?" William straightened, adjusting his grip on the cane. For a man his age, there was something in the way he carried himself, like he was stronger than he looked. "I've lived in this neighborhood for years, officer. I know these streets. And if you're implying I don't have the right to walk to my own home, you're mistaken." Eric's nostrils flared. It wasn't just the words. It was the way William said them, calm and deliberate, like he was trying to remind Eric that he, too, had rights. And that cut deeper than Eric wanted to admit. He had dealt with people who pushed back before, but this felt different. This wasn't defiance. This was something more subtle, more challenging. Eric stepped even closer now, his shadow looming over William, who still hadn't backed down. The night air was cool, but Eric could feel his blood heating up, his chest tightening. His fingers twitched near his belt, where his baton hung, ready if he needed it. "You need to stop acting like you're above the law," Eric hissed, his voice low but filled with barely restrained anger. "I'm giving you one last chance to tell me what you're really doing out here." For a moment, there was silence. William's eyes locked on Eric's, the old man's face unreadable. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, William said, "I'm not the one who needs to check himself." It was a simple statement, but it struck a nerve deep within Eric. He had spent years building up his authority, his power. He wore the badge, carried the gun. People didn't get to talk to him like that. Not in this neighborhood, not in this city. Before he knew what he was doing, Eric's hand shot out, grabbing William by the arm and pulling him forward with a rough jerk. The force of it sent William stumbling, his cane clattering to the ground as he struggled to keep his balance. The groceries spilled out of the bag, a loaf of bread rolling along the cracked pavement. "Watch it!" Eric spat, his face inches from William's. The old man regained his footing, standing taller now, his face still calm, though a faint bruise was beginning to form where Eric had grabbed him. "Let go of me," William said, his voice steady, though there was a new firmness in his tone. Eric's grip tightened, the tension between them almost palpable. His pulse was racing, his chest heaving. He could feel the heat rising in his body, the familiar surge of adrenaline that came when he was on the brink of losing control. "You don't tell me what to do," Eric growled, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "You don't know who you're dealing with." For the first time, William's calm exterior showed a crack, but not in the way Eric had expected. The old man's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice taking on an edge Eric hadn't heard before. "No, officer," William said quietly. "You don't know who you're dealing with." That was it, the final spark that lit the fuse. Without thinking, Eric's fist flew through the air, slamming into William's face with a sickening thud. The old man stumbled backward, collapsing to one knee as he clutched his face in pain. The force of the punch had sent him reeling, his cane now lying several feet away, useless. For a brief moment, Eric felt a surge of satisfaction. He had put the man in his place, made him realize who was in control here. But that satisfaction was fleeting. quickly replaced by a creeping sense of dread. William slowly pushed himself up, his hands shaking slightly as he wiped a small trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth. He straightened his posture, standing tall despite the pain. A bruise had already begun to form on his cheek, the skin darkening where Eric's fist had landed. But what shook Eric more than anything was the look in William's eyes. They weren't filled with anger or fear. Instead, they were calm, eerily calm considering what had just happened. It was the kind of calm that came from someone who had been through far worse and had come out the other side unscathed. As William stood there, bloodied but unbowed, Eric felt a sudden wave of uncertainty wash over him. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had expected fear, submission. But instead, William stood before him, his dignity intact, his eyes sharp and focused. Without a word, William reached into his coat again, moving slowly, deliberately. Eric tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt where his gun rested. But something in the old man's movements told Eric that he wasn't reaching for a weapon. Instead, William pulled out a small black wallet and flipped it open, holding it out for Eric to see. The badge inside gleamed under the streetlights, its golden surface catching the faint light. Eric's heart sank as he read the words engraved on it. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The realization hit him like a freight train. William Johnson wasn't just an old man. He was a retired FBI agent, and Eric had just assaulted him. Eric stood frozen, staring at the FBI badge in William's hand. His mind raced as the gravity of the situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. His breath quickened, his pulse pounded in his ears, and for the first time in years, a sense of helplessness gripped him. He messed up, badly. William held the badge steady, his face expressionless, though a faint shadow of disappointment seemed to linger in his eyes. It was the kind of look that made Eric feel small, like a child being scolded for stepping out of line. And yet William wasn't saying anything. He wasn't yelling or calling for backup. He wasn't even raising his voice. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic from the freeway. Eric's hand remained clenched at his side, still aching from the punch he had thrown just moments earlier. The bruised and bloodied face of the man in front of him told the story of his rage, but it was that badge, gleaming under the streetlights, that screamed of consequences. What? What do you want? Eric finally stated, his voice shaky. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. He assaulted a federal agent. There was no talking his way out of this one. William didn't respond right away. Instead, he slowly tucked the badge back into his coat pocket and retrieved his cane from the ground. He wiped his mouth again, dabbing at the blood with a handkerchief before finally speaking. I've already called for backup, William said quietly, his voice calm and measured. They'll be here any minute. Eric's stomach dropped. Backup. Of course William had called for backup. That's what a federal agent would do in this situation. He cursed under his breath, his thoughts spiraling out of control. What was going to happen now? He knew exactly what awaited him. Charges, a trial, the end of his career. He could already see the headlines in the local papers. Police officer arrested for assaulting FBI agent. The thought made him sick. Before Eric could say another word, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the air, growing louder by the second. The flashing lights of several squad cars appeared at the end of the street, casting an eerie glow over the darkened neighborhood. The cavalry was coming, and they weren't coming for William. They were coming for him. The squad cars rolled to a stop around them, and within moments, several officers and federal agents were stepping out of their vehicles, their faces hard and unreadable. Eric's heart pounded in his chest, his mouth dry as he watched them approach. There was no escape. One of the agents, a tall man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward and addressed William with a respectful nod. Agent Johnson, he said, his voice gruff. You all right? William nodded slowly, still holding the handkerchief to his bruised face. I'm fine, he replied, his voice steady. Just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Eric's eyes widened in disbelief. Was William actually going to downplay what had just happened? For a brief moment, hope flickered in Eric's chest. Maybe he wouldn't be arrested. Maybe William would let this slide, chalk it up to a mistake. But that hope quickly died when the gray-haired agent turned his cold gaze toward Eric. Officer Matthews, the agent said, his voice sharp. You're under arrest for assaulting a federal agent. Eric's blood ran cold. He felt the weight of those words, the finality of them. There was no getting out of this now. Two other agents moved in, one on each side of Eric. They were professional, not rough, but they weren't exactly gentle either. One of them grabbed his arm, pulling it behind his back, while the other snapped a pair of cold handcuffs onto his wrists. Eric flinched at the feel of the cuffs tightening around his wrists. He had been on the other side of this too many times to count. But this was different. He wasn't the one in control anymore. He wasn't the officer leading the arrest. He was the suspect now, the one who had crossed the line. His vision blurred as they led him toward one of the waiting squad cars, the flashing lights reflecting off every window in the neighborhood. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that people were watching from behind closed blinds. They always were. But he didn't care anymore. Everything was unraveling too fast. As they reached the car, the agent who had spoken to William stepped closer to Eric, his voice low and cold. You're done, Matthews. Your career is over. Those words hit Eric harder than any punch ever could. He had always feared something like this. Losing control, making a mistake that he couldn't take back. But he had never imagined it would actually happen. He had never believed it would come to this. As they pushed him into the back of the squad car, Eric caught one last glimpse of William standing on the sidewalk, watching him. The calm, quiet man who had changed everything with a single flick of his badge. Eric had thought he held all the power, but in the end, it was William who had the final say. The door slammed shut, sealing Eric's fate. Hours passed in a blur. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Eric sat in the holding cell, his hands still cuffed in front of him. His mind was numb, unable to process what had just happened. He had gone from being in control, the one calling the shots, to being trapped in this tiny, cold cell, waiting for someone to tell him what would happen next. The station was quieter than usual, a reflection of the late hour. But even in the stillness, Eric could feel the judgment in the air. His fellow officers avoided looking at him as they walked by the holding cell. Some of them whispered to each other, stealing glances in his direction before quickly looking away. Eric wanted to scream, to lash out, to explain what had happened. But what could he say? There was no justification for what he had done. He had let his anger, his pride, get the best of him. He had crossed a line, and now he was paying the price. The minutes stretched into hours, and the reality of the situation slowly began to sink in. His career was over. There was no coming back from this. He would be lucky if he wasn't facing prison time. Assaulting a federal agent wasn't something the department could sweep under the rug, not in this climate. And there would be no mercy for a cop who had let his personal biases drive him to violence. Eric's thoughts turned to his family. What would Marie say when she found out? She had been patient with him, forgiving of his long hours and emotional distance. But this would break her. And his kids. How could he face them after this? They had always looked up to him, seen him as their hero. What kind of example was he setting now? The sound of footsteps approached the cell, and Eric looked up to see Captain Susan Davis standing on the other side of the bars. Her face was hard, her arms crossed over her chest. She had been his commanding officer for years, and in all that time, she had never looked at him the way she was looking at him now. Matthews, she said, her voice cold. You really screwed up this time. Eric swallowed hard, his throat dry. Captain, Save it, she interrupted, raising a hand to cut him off. There's nothing you can say that's going to fix this. Do you even realize what you've done? Eric didn't respond. What was there to say? He assaulted a federal agent. That was the beginning and the end of it. Captain Davis sighed, shaking her head. You've been a good officer, Eric. You've served this department for years, and I've defended you more times than I can count. But this is too much. You've crossed a line, and I can't protect you anymore. Her words hit Eric like a punch to the gut. He had always counted on Captain Davis to have his back, to shield him from the worst of the department's politics. But even she couldn't save him from this. They're going to charge you with assault. Maybe even more, Captain Davis continued. And they're not going to hold back just because you wear a badge. Eric nodded numbly. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. I don't know what happens next for you, Eric. Captain Davis said, her voice softer now, almost sad. "But I hope you figure it out, because whatever happens, you're not a cop anymore. That part of your life is over." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Eric alone in the cell. The sound of her footsteps faded, and once again, Eric was left with nothing but the cold, harsh reality of what he had done. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial of Officer Eric Matthews began. Reporters filled the gallery, their notebooks and cameras at the ready, eager to capture every detail of the high-profile case. The story had become a national sensation, not just because a police officer was on trial for assaulting a federal agent, but because of the deeper conversation it had ignited, one about authority, racial profiling, and justice. Eric sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His attorney, an older man with a reputation for handling difficult cases, leaned in and whispered something, but Eric barely registered it. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the enormity of what was happening. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. The judge sat at the front, her expression stern and unreadable. The jury, a mix of men and women from different backgrounds, sat in silence, their eyes trained on him. And across the aisle, William Johnson sat with his son David, who would be leading the prosecution. Eric's gaze lingered on William for a moment. The old man looked composed as always, his face calm and focused. There was no anger in his eyes, no desire for revenge, just a quiet determination that made Eric's stomach churn. How could William be so calm, so composed after everything that had happened? The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to determine whether Officer Eric Matthews is guilty of the charges brought against him, including assault and civil rights violations. You will hear testimony from both sides, and it will be your duty to weigh the evidence carefully before rendering a verdict." Eric's attorney rose to give his opening statement, but Eric barely heard it. His thoughts were consumed by the overwhelming sense of dread that had been building since the night of the incident. He had never imagined that his career would end like this, in a courtroom, being judged not by his peers but by a group of strangers. When it was David Johnson's turn to speak, the room fell silent. David, tall and confident, walked to the center of the courtroom, his gaze fixed on the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and authoritative, "this case is about more than just an altercation between two men. It is about the abuse of power, the unchecked biases that drive certain individuals to believe they are above the law. My father, William Johnson, a retired FBI agent, was assaulted that night not because of anything he did, but because of how he was perceived, because of the color of his skin and the neighborhood he was in." Eric's heart sank as David's words hung in the air. He had always known that race would be a part of this trial, but hearing it framed so clearly, so pointedly, made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. David continued, "Officer Matthews didn't just assault my father, he violated his civil rights. He saw an elderly black man walking alone late at night and assumed the worst. He didn't ask questions. He didn't give my father the benefit of the doubt. Instead, he acted on impulse, driven by the biases that clouded his judgment." Eric's attorney objected, arguing that the prosecution was trying to paint Eric as a racist without evidence. But the damage had already been done. The jury had heard it, and Eric could see the way their expressions shifted, the way they looked at him now, as if they had already made up their minds. As the trial continued, Eric's world outside the courtroom began to unravel. His once strong marriage was now on the brink of collapse, the foundation of his personal life crumbling under the weight of his actions. At home, things had never been more strained. Marie had tried to stand by him at first, but the constant media attention, the whispers from their friends, and the shame that hung over them like a dark cloud had taken its toll. The night before the trial began, Marie confronted him in the kitchen, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I don't know how to do this anymore, Eric," she had said, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to be the wife of the man in the headlines, the man everyone is talking about, the man who did what you did." Eric had tried to explain himself, to tell her that he hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that he had just lost control for a moment. But Marie wasn't interested in excuses. She had heard enough of them over the years, and now in this moment of crisis, she couldn't bring herself to forgive him. "What about the kids?" she had asked, her voice trembling. "How am I supposed to explain this to them? How do I tell them that their father isn't the hero they thought he was? Eric had no answer. He had always prided himself on being a good father, on setting an example for his children. But now that image had been shattered, and there was no way to put it back together. Marie had moved out shortly after, taking the kids with her. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a hollow shell, a constant reminder of everything Eric had lost. He had thought the worst part of this ordeal would be losing his career, but losing his family, losing Marie, hurt more than he could have imagined. While Eric's life spiraled out of control, William remained calm and collected, just as he had been the night of the incident. But that calmness didn't mean he wasn't deeply affected by what had happened. The bruise on his face had faded, but the memory of that night still lingered in his mind, a reminder of the racial tensions that had always simmered beneath the surface. At home, William found solace in the quiet moments. He spent time in his garden, tending to the plants that had been his hobby for years. He read books and watched the news, keeping himself informed about the world outside. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, the trial was always in the back of his mind. David visited him often, checking in to see how his father was holding up. But there was something else driving David's visits, his desire for justice, for retribution against the man who had wronged his father. "You need to testify," David had said one evening as they sat on the back porch, the sun setting in the distance. "You need to make sure the jury hears what happened that night, from your perspective." William had nodded, knowing that David was right. But it wasn't that simple for him. He had spent decades in law enforcement, upholding justice, protecting people from harm. He had seen the worst humanity had to offer, but he had also seen the best. He didn't want to bring another man down, even if that man had hurt him. David didn't understand that. To him, this was black and white. Officer Matthews had assaulted his father, and he needed to be held accountable. But for William, it was more complicated than that. He didn't want vengeance. He wanted something deeper. He wanted understanding, reconciliation, healing. And he wasn't sure that a guilty verdict in a courtroom would bring any of that. "You know I'll do what needs to be done," William finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'm not in this to destroy a man's life, David. That's not who I am." David had looked at him, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Dad, this isn't just about you. This is about every black man who's been profiled, every person who's been treated like a suspect because of the color of their skin. You can't just let him off the hook." William had smiled faintly, understanding his son's passion but feeling the weight of his own years of experience. "Justice isn't about making someone pay," he said softly. "It's about making things right." The courtroom was packed on the day the jury returned with their verdict. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, as everyone waited to hear the fate of Officer Eric Matthews. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras ready to capture the moment. The public had been following the trial closely, debating both sides in online forums, in news articles, and over dinner tables across the country. Eric sat at the defense table, his heart pounding in his chest. His attorney had prepared him for this moment, telling him to stay calm, to maintain his composure no matter the outcome. But as the minutes ticked by, the weight of everything pressed down on him. He could barely breathe. Across the room, William sat with his son David, both men watching the proceedings intently. William's expression was calm, but his hands were folded tightly in his lap. David, on the other hand, sat forward in his seat, his body tense with anticipation. He wanted justice for his father, and this was the moment it would either be served or denied. The jury filed into the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. The foreman held a piece of paper in his hands, and the silence in the room was deafening as he approached the judge. Eric felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of his life. The judge unfolded the paper and read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Eric Matthews, guilty of assault and violation of civil rights." The words hit Eric like a physical blow. His head spun, and for a moment, he felt like the room was closing in around him. Guilty. The word echoed in his mind, reverberating over and over, drowning out everything else. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something, but Eric didn't hear it. All he could think about was the word guilty and what it meant for him. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed, and he would be facing prison time for what he had done. He glanced over at William, expecting to see satisfaction in his eyes, but instead, he saw something else, something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger or triumph. It was something softer, almost like regret. The judge began to speak, outlining the sentencing guidelines. Officer Matthews, you have been found guilty of violating the civil rights of William Johnson, a retired federal agent, and assaulting him in an act of unchecked aggression. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Eric barely registered the sentence. The room felt distant, the sounds muted, as if he were underwater. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had gone from being a respected police officer to a convicted felon in a matter of months. The gavel slammed down, and just like that, it was over. The courtroom felt smaller than usual as the jury read their verdict, each word weighing down on Eric like a lead weight. The air was thick with tension, and the reporters had gone quiet, their pens poised, waiting for the final confirmation that Officer Eric Matthews, once a respected figure of authority, was now officially guilty. Eric sat motionless as the judge's words echoed in the courtroom. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of assault and violation of civil rights. The words reverberated in Eric's mind. He had known this was coming, but now that it was real, he felt as if he had been punched in the gut. His attorney, seated next to him, leaned over and whispered something, but the words didn't register. Eric was caught in the enormity of what had just happened. Everything he had built, his career, his reputation, his sense of control had been torn down in a matter of minutes. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Some people were satisfied, nodding quietly as if justice had finally been served. Others whispered with a sense of shock, as if they hadn't fully expected the jury to convict a police officer. William sat across the room, his expression calm but thoughtful. He had been through the trial with quiet resolve, attending every session, offering his testimony without anger or spite. Now, even in this moment of supposed victory, he did not seem triumphant. Instead, he looked as though he carried the weight of everything that had happened, not just to him, but to Eric as well. Eric's thoughts turned to his family. He hadn't seen his children in weeks, and Marie had stopped responding to his calls. He imagined how she must be feeling, sitting at home, seeing the trial unfold in the news, watching the father of her children crumble under the public spotlight. How was she going to explain this to them? What kind of future did they have now, with him behind bars? When the judge handed down the sentence, 5 years in federal prison, the room went silent once again. 5 years, it felt like a lifetime. Eric had seen men sentenced before, had watched them break down as they faced the harsh reality of prison life. Now it was his turn. The judge gave Eric one final look before slamming down the gavel, signaling the end of the trial. "Court is adjourned," she said, and just like that, the room exploded into a flurry of movement. Reporters rushed to the doors, their cameras flashing as they captured every angle of Eric being led away by officers. People shuffled out, some muttering quietly to themselves, others speaking in hushed tones about the significance of the case. As Eric was led out of the courtroom, his eyes met William's. There was no animosity in William's gaze, just a quiet understanding. That look lingered with Eric as he was escorted out of the building, placed into the back of a waiting police vehicle, and driven away. The first few weeks in prison were a blur for Eric. He was transferred to a federal facility where he was placed in the general population. It was a stark contrast to the life he had once known, patrolling the streets with a badge, wielding authority over others. Now, he was just another inmate, stripped of his power, his identity reduced to a number. Eric kept to himself in the beginning, avoiding the other prisoners as much as possible. The prison guards knew who he was, of course, and that made things complicated. Some of them treated him with disdain, while others seemed to pity him. He had been one of them once, but now he was on the other side. The days dragged on, filled with monotony. The sounds of prison life became a background hum. Doors slamming, inmates yelling, guards barking orders. At night, Eric lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering how his life had come to this. But as time passed, something inside him began to shift. He started to reflect on everything that had led him here. His anger, his biases, the way he had let his frustration with the world fester until it consumed him. He had never thought of himself as a bad person, But now, sitting in a prison cell, he couldn't escape the truth. He had made choices, and those choices had consequences. One day, while sitting alone in the prison yard, Eric found himself thinking about William Johnson. The old man's calm, steady presence haunted him. Even after the verdict, after everything that had happened, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that William had wanted something more than a guilty verdict. It was as if he had been waiting for Eric to understand something deeper. Prison was exactly as Eric had imagined it would be: cold, unforgiving, and devoid of any sense of control. The clanging of metal doors, the harsh fluorescent lights, and the constant surveillance were reminders that he was no longer the one in charge. His first days were a blur. He kept to himself, unsure of how to navigate this new world. Some of the other inmates recognized him. News of his trial had been broadcast widely. Some respected him for having been a cop. Others eyed him with suspicion, and a few resented him outright. He had been part of the system that had locked many of them up, and now he was one of them. In those early days, Eric couldn't stop thinking about everything he had lost. His mind was consumed with thoughts of his family, his children, their faces, the soccer games he had missed, the conversations he would never have with them. His marriage, once the bedrock of his life, had been crumbling long before the trial, and now it was as if the foundation had been washed away entirely. Marie hadn't filed for divorce yet, but she had stopped visiting, and Eric knew it was only a matter of time before the papers arrived. The worst part of it all wasn't the trial or the loss of his career. It was the knowledge that he had let down the people who had depended on him most. He had let his anger, his frustrations, and his prejudices destroy everything he had worked for. Life inside was monotonous, broken only by occasional moments of confrontation or tension between inmates. Eric tried to stay under the radar, avoiding trouble whenever possible. He had learned quickly that his status as a former cop made him a target for some, but he had also learned to keep his head down, to blend in with the crowd. But blending in didn't stop the thoughts that kept creeping in when he lay awake at night, staring up at the gray ceiling of his cell. Each night was the same. He would replay the events of that fateful night with William Johnson over and over in his mind, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Eric started attending therapy sessions offered by the prison. At first, he had been reluctant, convinced that nothing could help him make sense of what he had done. But the weight of his guilt grew heavier each day, and he knew he needed an outlet. In therapy, Eric began to confront the realities of his actions. He spoke about the years of frustration that had built up, how he had let his biases shape his perception of the world around him, and how he had lashed out at William that night without thinking. The therapist, a man named Dr. Collins, listened patiently, offering insights that Eric had never considered before. "You've spent years defining yourself by your badge, by your authority," Dr. Collins had said during one session. "But who are you without that? What happens when the badge is taken away?" Eric didn't have an answer then, but it was a question that stayed with him long after the session ended. As the months passed, Eric found himself reaching for something more. He began reading books about civil rights, justice, and the history of racial tension in America. He read accounts of men and women who had fought against the very system he had been a part of, and it opened his eyes in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time, Eric truly began to understand the weight of what he had done, not just to William, but to the community he had sworn to protect. One day, as Eric sat alone in the prison library, a memory from his childhood surfaced. He had been 10 years old, sitting in the living room with his father, who had been a police officer too. His father had always been his hero, a man who believed in justice and order. But there was a lesson his father had taught him that he hadn't thought about in years. "Son," his father had said, "you've got to understand that wearing the badge doesn't make you better than anyone else. It just means you've got a responsibility to do better, to be better." At the time, Eric hadn't fully understood what his father meant. But now, sitting in prison, those words took on a new meaning. He had forgotten that lesson, had let the power of the badge cloud his judgment. He had failed to live up to the responsibility that came with the authority he had been given. It was then that Eric made the decision to write to William. It took several more months before Eric finally mustered the courage to write a letter. He wasn't sure what to say or even if William would want to hear from him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to reach out, to try and make amends, even if it was too late. Sitting on his bunk, Eric stared down at the blank piece of paper in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the pen, the weight of everything he had been carrying finally settling on his shoulders. He took a deep breath and began to write. "Dear Mr. Johnson," he started, the words coming slowly at first. "I don't know if you'll read this, or if you even want to hear from me, but I feel like I need to say something, even if it's just to put it out into the world." Eric paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I want to apologize, not just for what I did that night, but for everything that led up to it, for the way I treated you, for the way I let my own anger and frustration guide my actions. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I know I have to live with the consequences of what I did, but I need you to know that I'm sorry." He hesitated again, wondering if the words sounded hollow, but then he pressed on. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about that night and about how things could have gone differently. I know now that I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment. I thought I was in control, but the truth is, I was never really in control of anything. I don't know if this letter will mean anything to you, but I hope that maybe, someday, we can find a way to move past what happened." Eric signed the letter and sealed it in an envelope. He wasn't sure if William would respond, or if he would even want to, but for the first time in a long time, Eric felt a small sense of relief. He had taken the first step toward acknowledging his mistakes. Several weeks later, William sat at his kitchen table, a small envelope in front of him. He recognized the name on the return address, Eric Matthews. For a moment, William hesitated, unsure if he wanted to open it. But then, curiosity got the better of him, and he carefully tore the envelope open. As he read the letter, a quiet sigh escaped his lips. Eric's words were raw, honest in a way William hadn't expected. He had seen many men break under the weight of their guilt, but there was something different in Eric's letter. It wasn't just an apology, it was a recognition of everything that had gone wrong, both in that moment and in the years leading up to it. William folded the letter and set it down on the table. He had spent his entire career in law enforcement, and he had seen what unchecked power could do to a man. He had witnessed the way biases and prejudices could shape the decisions of even the most well-meaning officers. But he had also seen redemption, and he believed in second chances. After a long moment of quiet reflection, William made his decision. He would respond to Eric's letter, but not with anger or judgment. Instead, he would offer forgiveness. He picked up his pen and began to write. "Dear Eric, I received your letter, and I appreciate your words. I know that what happened that night was complicated, and I know that you have been carrying a heavy burden. I want you to know that I forgive you. Not because I excuse what you did, but because I believe in the power of forgiveness. We all make mistakes, but it's what we do afterward that defines us." William continued, "I hope that you will use this time to reflect, to learn, and to grow. The world needs more people who are willing to confront their own flaws and work toward a better future. I believe you can be one of those people." He signed the letter and placed it in an envelope. As he sealed it, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. Forgiveness had never been about letting someone off the hook. It had always been about healing, for both himself and the person seeking redemption. While Eric's life had become a cycle of reflection and routine in prison, William's life had returned to a semblance of normalcy after the trial. But it wasn't the same. Despite the guilty verdict, William didn't feel triumphant. The victory felt hollow, as though the trial had been about something much bigger than just that one night. The country had taken sides, and for weeks he had been approached by journalists, activists, and people in his community, asking him to speak out more, to give more interviews, to take on the role of a spokesperson for racial justice. But William wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. He had lived his life with quiet dignity, believing that actions spoke louder than words. He had spent years in the FBI, working quietly, doing what he believed was right. He didn't want to be thrust into the spotlight now, even if the world seemed to want him to become a voice for change. Instead, William focused on his own healing. The physical wounds from the assault had long since healed, but the emotional toll lingered. He spent time with his son, David, who had taken the trial personally, seeing it as a battle that needed to be won not just for their family, but for the larger cause. David, though proud of the verdict, had struggled to understand his father's reluctance to embrace the role of an advocate. "Dad," he had said one evening over dinner, "you could make such a difference. People listen to you. They respect you." William had smiled softly, shaking his head. David, I've fought my battles in life. I've seen things change, but I've also seen them stay the same. I'm not a man who craves the spotlight. I just want to live my life peacefully. David hadn't fully understood, but he respected his father's wishes. And so, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. But William wasn't completely at peace. There was something unresolved, something that lingered in his thoughts every now and then. It wasn't anger toward Eric, but something more complicated. He had seen the look in Eric's eyes during the trial, the look of a man who had lost everything, not just because of one mistake, but because of a lifetime of unchecked biases and misjudgments. One day, as William sat on his porch, a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Eric Matthews. William stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it. As he read the letter, he felt a mixture of emotions: sympathy, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of closure. Eric had written from a place of vulnerability, acknowledging the wrongs he had committed and expressing a genuine desire for redemption. For William, the letter was a turning point. He had always believed in second chances, in the possibility that people could change. And while he didn't excuse what Eric had done, he understood that forgiveness wasn't about letting someone off the hook. It was about freeing yourself from the burden of anger. Eric didn't expect a response from William, but one day, several weeks after sending the letter, he received one. The envelope was simple, the return address unmistakable. In the letter, William expressed forgiveness, not absolution, but a recognition that Eric had acknowledged his mistakes and was working to atone for them. He wrote, "I believe that we all have the capacity for change, and I hope that you continue on the path you've started. Forgiveness is not about forgetting, it's about learning, growing, and doing better. I wish you the best in your journey." Reading those words, Eric felt something lift from his chest. The burden of guilt he had been carrying wasn't gone, but it was lighter. He had been given a second chance, not by the court, but by the man he had wronged. With renewed purpose, Eric began seeking ways to make amends. He joined programs in the prison that focused on restorative justice, learning how to confront the harm he had caused and how to begin repairing the damage. He volunteered to speak with younger inmates, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned about power, authority, and the dangers of letting anger and bias take control. It wasn't easy. There were days when Eric questioned whether he could ever truly redeem himself, whether he could ever atone for what he had done. But he kept going, driven by the knowledge that change wasn't instantaneous. It was a process, a journey. As his release date approached, Eric began to think about what his life would look like after prison. He had lost his career, his marriage, and the respect of many people, but he had gained something else, a new understanding of himself and the world around him. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that courtroom months ago. He was someone who had been broken, who had fallen, but who had also begun the slow, difficult climb toward redemption. The story of Eric Matthews and William Johnson is not just about punishment and forgiveness. It's a powerful reminder that with power comes responsibility, that every action has consequences, and that true change starts from within. Through Eric's downfall and William's compassionate forgiveness, we learn that no one is beyond redemption, as long as we are willing to confront our mistakes and strive to be better. If this story resonated with you and brought value to your life, please subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay connected with more inspiring stories that challenge us to reflect on justice, forgiveness, and personal growth. Together, we can explore more narratives that encourage change and understanding. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to sharing more with you.